Sunday school teacher, I'm glad that you have joined us for our time of study and preparation. I'm Tim Smith with Sunday School University, and we're working on the lesson for Sunday, October 20th. The title of this lesson is Together. Again, we're in the book of Acts. We're going to be in Acts chapter 18. Again, the title of this lesson is Together. The point, the thing that we want our people walking out with when we finish our time together is believers find greater effectiveness when partnering with other believers. And so the title of the lesson is Together. In this session, we see Paul needing a way to support himself and having a place to live in Corinth. Priscilla and Aquila were able to meet those needs and thus began a great partnership. The partnership was not static, in other words, in one location, but it continued to grow and evolve as their situations changed. When Silas and Timothy returned from their assignment and bringing the financial help, the situation changed for Paul, and again, Priscilla and Aquila all adapted well to that change. Again, Priscilla and Aquila's partnership with Paul changed with the situation, but it always focused on advancing the kingdom of God. So let's look at these verses, Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 4, and there we see build relationships. After this, he left Athens and went to Corinth, where he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul came to them, and since they were of the same occupation, tent makers by trade, he stayed with them and worked. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade both Jew and Greek. In verse 1 here, we see that after some time had passed, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. Corinth was a Roman colony and was the capital of the province of Achaia. Corinth was a commercial center, place of business. There was a east-west sea trade route, and there was a north-south land trade route. And so it was a city that was in a transportation hub that helped it be that business center. It was famous for its pottery, the manufacturing of metal, and well as carpet weaving. In verse 2, Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla. Aquila was from the Roman province of Pontus, which is to what we would know as modern Turkey. They had recently moved from Italy to Corinth because of the edict from the Roman Emperor Claudius. In AD 49, he expelled between 40 to 50,000 Jews from Rome due to the conflict between the Jews and the Christians. And so he just said, the way I'm going to handle this is you got problems, get out. And so there was such a conflict between the Jews and the Christian Jews that he kicked them out of Rome. In verse 3, Paul stayed with Aquila and Priscilla and worked alongside them as tent makers. Tent maker, that word that is used there is an interesting word because it basically, when you translate it, it's understood to be like a stagehand in the theater, making props, making backdrops. But for what we understand, this was more of like a leather worker, because that's what Paul did. Now, Priscilla is usually mentioned before Aquila as we go through the rest of the life of Paul. The reason that Priscilla is usually mentioned before her husband is probably due to her status within the Christian community, because she was the more prominent Christian leader. In verse 4, Paul's custom was to be in the synagogue on the Sabbath and reason, and that's having discussion and debate. He would reason with the Jews about Jesus. Now that word reasoned is proclaiming the gospel. That's what Paul did. And the Jews that are mentioned there in verse 4 are the ones that would engage him in a conversation. The Greeks were non-Jews, but they were sympathetic to Judaism, and probably would have become full-fledged Jews, but they had not yet been circumcised. And so when he says reason with the Jews and the Greeks in the synagogue, it's those Jews in the synagogue that would engage him, but also the Greeks that are mentioned there are those who were sympathetic toward Judaism or have an interest in the things of God and found Paul's teachings to be interesting. Well, let's look at verses 5 through 11, and there we see share the gospel. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself to preaching the word and testifying to the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. When they resisted and blasphemed, he shook his clothes and told them, "Your blood is on your own heads. I am innocent. For now I will go to the Gentiles." So he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Judas, a worshiper of God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord along with his whole household. Many Corinthians, when they heard, believed and were baptized. The Lord said to Paul at night in a vision, "Don't be afraid, but keep on speaking and don't be silent. For I am with you. No one will lay a hand on you to hurt you, because I have many people in this city." He stayed there a year and a half, teaching the Word of God among them. So in verse 5, we see that Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia and they rejoined Paul. Silas and Timothy had been in Berea on their assignment of missions. Paul had sent word back to them to come to him as quickly as they were able to. And when they returned, they brought enough funds from the other churches where they had been on mission, where Paul had been previously. They brought enough funds that allowed Paul to continue his ministry full time and not have a bivocational approach to ministry. In verse 6, the resistance and blasphemy of the Jews made it impossible for him to continue his ministry in the synagogue. In other words, it went from a pleasant conversation to him not being able to get a word in edgewise. And so what he did is he shook out his clothes. That's the term that is used there. It is a symbolic action of communicating that he did not want a speck of dust to remain on him. In other words, he wanted to forget this whole experience and not have anything to do with them. Because they had rejected Paul's message, God's judgment on them for their sin was on them, not Paul. In other words, Paul had done his job. And then he says, "I'm going to the Gentiles." Now this was not a complete abandonment of the Jews. but he was focusing in this community his ministry to the Gentiles. In verse 7, Paul took the gospel to the Gentiles, sharing in the home of Titius Judas, and he's a God-fearer. And it is interesting, the location of his home being right next door to the synagogue. And so you can just picture Paul being in ministry as people were headed in to the synagogue. In verse 8, we see that the leader of the synagogue became a Christian, became a follower of Jesus, became a believer. Now this leader, he was responsible for the Jewish religious gatherings, as well as the administrative and political affairs of the entire Jewish community. So this is significant that this happened. It also says that his entire household, Crispus' entire household, believed that Jesus is the Messiah. We also learn from Luke, of what he says here in verse 8, that many Christians, many Corinthians believed and became Christians. They were baptized and became Christians. And then in verses 9 through 11, we see that God affirms Paul and that I'm with you and I'm going to protect you. And as a result, Paul stayed there for 1.5 years doing ministry. Well, let's look at verses 18 through 21, and there we see follow God's lead. After staying some time, Paul said farewell to the brothers and to the sisters and sailed away to Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. He shaved his head because of a vow that he had taken, and when they reached Ephesus, he left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and debated the Jews. When they asked him to stay a little longer, he declined, but he said farewell and said, I'll come back to you again if God's will. Then he set sail from Ephesus. In verse 18, after saying farewell to the believers in Corinth, Paul set sail for Syria, going back home to the home base of the church at Antioch of Syria. It is mentioned here the name of the town, the port city, Cenchreae. This is the eastern port of Corinth and south of the city. But also we know in verse 18 it says that he shaved his head. And why? Because God had faithfully fulfilled his promise. And Paul had completed the task. In other words, God did what he said and I've done what he asked me. And so he shaved his head as a sign of that. In verse 19, Ephesus was the end destination for Priscilla and Aquila. They would continue the work in Ephesus, and Saul would sail on to Syria. Now, he stayed there for a little while, but he could not wait. He could not stay there. He wanted to get back to Antioch. And then in verse 21, Paul said goodbye to the Jews and to the believers at Ephesus. Here we know that the missionary activities were dependent upon the will and the direction of God, because that's what he says here. He says, I will come back to you if God wills. In other words, he's saying everything that I've been about, everything I've done has been because it's been God's will. Now, we do know this, that the apostles' time in Caesarea, Jerusalem, and Antioch were very brief. We see that in verses 22 and 23. And then by the opening of chapter 19, Paul had already begun to travel back to Ephesus. So let's talk about this lesson. Your summary points. Number one, for these scriptures, believers should continually seek to build relationships for the purpose of shared ministry. We are better together. Cooperation is the key. We've got to work together. Yes, within our church, we've got to be a band of brothers and sisters all working together and pulling in the same direction. But also, the churches in our neighborhood, in our city, in our county are our partners, and we need to learn to work together and to cooperate for the spread of the gospel. Number two, partnership with other believers provide a solid foundation for ministry. We're better together. And so don't try to have ministry in isolation, but learn to work together, both in your church and with other churches. Learn to work together. And then number three, believers may be called on to serve independently to further the kingdom. Now that's talking about going and serving and being missionaries, like what Paul did. But the partnership in ministry is what sustained him. I'm giving you some ideas about creating interest in this lesson, and then also some ideas about application. First thing, how has partnership aided the ministry in your church? Think about examples of how partnership has helped your church. And then the final thought is, what can we do as a group, what can we do as a class to be a better partner in ministry? Well, remember the title of the lesson is Together. The point is, believers find greater effectiveness when partnering with other believers. Well, I'll be praying for you as you teach this lesson this coming Sunday. God bless you.